The apartment building's pipes and heating systems had become his theater for 30 years, but in his dreams, Antonio Tony Castellano still saw the sweeping staircases, elaborate backdrops, and magical transformations he'd once created for Broadway's greatest productions. Tony, 66, sat in the first row of the Tonight Show studio, his set designer's eye automatically analyzing the staging, lighting angles, and spatial relationships, while his craftsman's hands moved in unconscious measuring gestures on his lap. The small Riverside Towers Super 30-year service patch on his work shirt caught the studio lights as he shifted with the precise movements of someone who had spent decades understanding how spaces worked and how to make them serve human needs. To the hundreds of tenants whose maintenance requests Tony had handled over 3 decades, he was just another reliable building superintendent who somehow always knew exactly how to fix any problem and had an unusual ability to make cramped apartments feel more spacious. What they didn't know was that their plumbing was being repaired by a man who had won a Tony Award for Best Scenic Design and created the magical worlds that had transported millions of theatergoers. What Tony didn't know was that his story had been quietly circulating among theater professionals after a former colleague had recognized him in a building management newsletter featuring dedicated supers who keep NYC running. The photo had caught the attention of Broadway designers who remembered Antonio Castellano as one of the most innovative and respected set designers of the 1980s and early 1990s. Tony's story had begun with a love of theater that had driven him through the competitive world of scenic design and Broadway production. Born in Little Italy to parents who were both skilled carpenters, Tony had shown an early fascination with how spaces could be transformed to tell stories, spending his childhood building elaborate dollhouse sets and dreaming of creating the magical worlds he saw on Broadway stages. After graduating from Yale School of Drama with an MFA in scenic design in 1981, Tony had specialized in creating immersive environments that didn't just support the story but became integral to the theatrical experience. His designs combined traditional craftsmanship with innovative engineering, creating sets that could transform before audiences' eyes through mechanical ingenuity and artistic vision. Over 15 years, Tony Castellano had become one of Broadway's most sought-after set designers. He'd created the magical forest that grew and bloomed during Into the Woods, designed the rotating factory set for Working that critics called a masterpiece of theatrical engineering, and won the Tony Award for Best Scenic Design in 1994 for his work on The Secret Garden, which featured a stage that literally bloomed with real flowers and living vines as the story unfolded. But the theater world had changed dramatically in the late 1900s and 90s. Rising production costs had led producers to favor simpler, cheaper sets that could be easily transported for touring productions. Tony's elaborate, custom-built designs had become too expensive for most Broadway budgets, and younger designers who could create effective sets using digital projections and minimal physical elements had replaced craftsmen who built intricate mechanical masterpieces. The building superintendent job had started as temporary work in 1994, while Tony figured out how to adapt his design skills to a changed theater industry. But 30 years later, he'd discovered unexpected satisfaction in solving the practical problems of keeping a residential building functioning smoothly, applying the same engineering creativity that had once made Broadway sets work to making sure tenants had heat, water, and functioning appliances. The Tonight Show tickets had been a surprise gift from the Riverside Towers tenants, who had pooled their resources to honor the man who had not only kept their building running perfectly for 30 years, but had somehow made even the most mundane repairs feel like acts of creative problem solving. It was a Tuesday night taping in August, and Jimmy was in good spirits after interviewing a Broadway star about her new musical revival. During his commercial break interaction with the audience, his attention was drawn to Tony by the way he was examining the studio's set construction with obvious technical expertise. "Sir, you're looking at our set like someone who really understands stagecraft. Are you in the theater business?" Tony straightened with the practiced posture of someone who had spent years collaborating with directors and producers. "Building superintendent, sir. Riverside Towers on the Upper West Side. Been there 30 years, keeping everything running for our tenants." A warm murmur went through the nearby audience members. Building superintendents were the unsung heroes who kept New York functioning, and 30 years of reliable service deserved recognition. 30 years as a super, you must be incredibly skilled at solving all kinds of problems. Tony's face lit up with genuine pride in his craftsmanship. Every day's different. Plumbing emergencies, electrical issues, heating problems, space planning when tenants want to renovate. You learn to see how systems work together, how to make spaces function better for the people who live in them. You talk about it almost like designing spaces, very sophisticated understanding of how environments serve human needs. Well, good maintenance is really about understanding how people use spaces and making sure everything works the way it should, whether you're fixing a kitchen or creating any kind of functional environment. The principles are similar. Jimmy noticed something in Tony's language, a design-oriented sophistication that suggested experience beyond typical building maintenance. Tony, have you always worked in building management? You seem to have a designer's eye for how spaces work. Tony paused, as if deciding how much of his background to reveal. Actually, I used to work in theater before I became a super, set design specifically. Broadway shows, creating the physical environments where stories happen. The mention of Broadway set design caught the audience's attention immediately. Broadway design was one of the most prestigious and competitive fields in American theater. You designed sets for Broadway? Tony, that's incredible. What shows did you work on? Several productions over 15 years. Into the Woods, Working, The Secret Garden, some others. I specialized in sets that could transform during performances, mechanical designs that help tell the story visually. Jimmy's curiosity exploded. Broadway set designers were among the most respected artists in theater, and someone with that background, working as a building superintendent, suggested a dramatic story. Jimmy made a decision that would change everything. So, Tony, Broadway set design is serious theatrical artistry. Would you mind coming down here and telling us about your theater career? Tony looked uncertain. Oh, I don't think people want to hear about old theater stories. That world is very different from popular entertainment. Trust me, people definitely want to hear about Broadway design. Come on down. As Tony made her way to the stage with the confident stride of someone who had once walked through Broadway theaters, collaborating with directors and stars, his bearing transformed completely. The authoritative presence of someone who had once been responsible for creating the magical worlds that transported audiences. When he reached the stage, Jimmy guided him to a comfortable chair. Ladies and gentlemen, Jimmy announced, this is Tony Castellano. For 30 years, he's been keeping Riverside Towers running smoothly, but before that, he spent 15 years designing sets for Broadway shows. Tony, tell us about your theatrical career. Tony settled into the chair, and when he spoke about set design, his voice took on the passion and expertise of someone who had mastered one of theater's most challenging technical arts. Set design is about creating physical environments that don't just support the story, but become part of the storytelling. You're building worlds that have to work mechanically, look beautiful aesthetically, and serve the director's vision while keeping the actors safe during performance. The audience was completely quiet, understanding they were hearing about one of theater's most complex artistic disciplines. What was your most challenging design? Tony's eyes lit up with memories of his most creative work, probably The Secret Garden. The story required the stage to literally transform from a dead, gray garden into a living, blooming paradise as the characters healed emotionally. We built a stage with hydraulic systems that could raise real plants and flowers, water features that activated during key scenes, and lighting that made everything grow before the audience's eyes. That sounds incredibly complex. How do you make a stage bloom with real plants? Months of engineering and testing. We had to design irrigation systems hidden beneath the stage floor, timing mechanisms that coordinated plant emergence with musical cues, and backup systems in case anything failed during live performance. Every night, we were essentially growing a garden in real time. Jimmy reached behind his chair and pulled out a tablet loaded with theater databases and Tony Award records. Tony, we did some research before tonight's show. He showed Tony archive reviews and award documentation. According to Tony Award records, Antonio Castellano won Best Scenic Design in 1994 for The Secret Garden. Tony looked stunned. You found my Tony Award information? We did. Listen to this review from the New York Times. Castellano's set design for The Secret Garden is nothing short of miraculous. His ability to make the stage literally bloom with life creates theatrical magic that elevates the entire production. The studio fell completely silent. The audience was processing that they were meeting a Tony Award winner who had been working as a building superintendent for 30 years. Tony, you won a Tony Award. You were clearly successful as a set designer. Why did you leave Broadway? Tony's expression grew more reflective, touching on painful changes in the theater industry. The economics of Broadway changed in the late 90s. Producers wanted cheaper, simpler sets that could tour easily. My elaborate mechanical designs became too expensive for most productions. Younger designers who could create effective sets with projections and minimal physical elements replaced craftsmen who built complex practical environments. So, you became a building superintendent? I needed income while I figured out how to adapt to the new theater economy. But 30 years later, I discovered something unexpected. Solving building maintenance problems uses the same creative engineering skills that made me good at set design. Both jobs are about making environments work perfectly for the people who use them. Jimmy leaned forward. But you never stopped being a designer, did you? Tony smiled for the first time since taking the stage. You can't unlearn how to see spaces and understand how to improve them. When tenants want to renovate their apartments, I help them understand how to make small spaces feel larger, how to improve traffic flow, how to create environments that serve their needs better. Jimmy continued reading from the tablet. Tony, we found something else. Several Broadway producers have been trying to locate you for consulting work on shows that require complex mechanical set designs. Producers want to find me? Listen to this from a current Broadway producer. Antonio Castellano's mechanical engineering skills and artistic vision are legendary in our community. Modern Broadway could benefit enormously from his expertise in creating practical effects that can't be replicated digitally. Jimmy stood and addressed the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, this man spent 15 years creating the magical worlds that millions of people experienced on Broadway, then spent 30 years applying that same creative problem solving to keeping New Yorkers comfortable in their homes. He turned back to Tony. The theater community wants to honor you. The Tony Awards Committee wants to feature your work in their Unsung Heroes of Broadway exhibition, and several producers want to offer you consulting positions on shows requiring complex set engineering. Tony's eyes filled with tears. They want to honor my Broadway work? They do. And Tony, there's something else. Theater design schools are using your Secret Garden set as a case study for how to integrate mechanical engineering with artistic vision. Jimmy had one more surprise. We have someone here who wanted to meet you. From backstage, David Corrins, the Tony-nominated set designer for Hamilton and other hit Broadway shows, appeared, carrying blueprints and design sketches. Tony, Corrins said, approaching with obvious respect, I've been studying your work since design school. Your mechanical innovations and artistic vision influenced how I approach set design. You created standards for theatrical engineering that we still aspire to achieve. Tony was openly crying now, overwhelmed by recognition from the Broadway community he'd thought had forgotten him. You know my design work. Every serious set designer knows Antonio Castellano. Your Secret Garden design is still talked about as one of the most ambitious and successful mechanical sets in Broadway history. You've proved that elaborate practical effects could enhance storytelling in ways that digital effects never could. Jimmy sat back down beside Tony. Tony, you've spent 30 years thinking your Broadway career was over, but what you really did was continue using your design expertise to create better living environments while your theatrical innovations continued influencing how sets are designed. As they helped Tony back to his seat, he stopped and looked out at the audience one more time. Thank you for honoring my work, but I want young designers to know creativity doesn't end when one opportunity closes. The skills that made me good at creating theatrical magic are the same skills that help me solve everyday problems for my tenants. Design is about serving human needs, whether the stage is Broadway or an apartment building. The episode that aired became one of the most inspiring Tonight Show segments ever, sparking conversations about hidden talent and the artists working in everyday jobs while maintaining their creative skills. Tony's story inspired several Broadway productions to seek out former designers for consulting work, recognizing that experienced craftsmanship couldn't be replicated by digital technology. His Tony Award was featured in the building's lobby as a reminder that extraordinary talent existed in unexpected places. Tony spent his retirement consulting on Broadway shows requiring complex mechanical effects while continuing his building superintendent work part-time, discovering that leaving theater hadn't ended his design career, it had expanded his understanding of how creativity could serve people in multiple ways. At 68, Tony still approaches every problem with a designer's creative thinking, still believes that environments should serve and inspire the people who use them, and still carries his Tony Award alongside his building maintenance tools. A reminder that true artists never stop creating, they just find new stages for their talents. Because sometimes the most important designs happen not on Broadway stages seen by thousands, but in apartment buildings where a former set designer continues creating environments that help people live better, one perfectly solved problem at a time.